Yeah, we have to say the worst fears did not materialize. Nonetheless, Brexit was a major turning point, especially for the British. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have shown how much the UK and the EU depend on each other. But on January 31st in 2020, the United Kingdom left the European Union, and exactly 1 year later, the EU Internal Market and the Customs Union. After 47 years as a key EU member, Britain raised significant trade barriers with its neighbours and vice versa. And the country is now pursuing a comprehensive rejection of EU standards and norms, which is affecting planning security for companies and, of course, bilateral trade. And EU-UK trade relations remain at risk here. The UK is increasingly distancing itself from the EU agreement with its political decisions. This can be seen, for example, in the unilateral change in the provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol that happened before the Windsor Framework. And in doing so, Britain broke the rules agreed with the EU and triggered several dispute settlement procedures, one even at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. In addition, the British government has decided to delete the references to EU regulations in all legal text, although they failed there, kind of. In particular, the plans to deviate from EU rules and standards, for example in data protection, food or chemicals, also undermine the necessary predictability in UK business for many companies. It's important here that the EU continues to act resolutely together and defend European economic interests. The British exit from the European Union is a crucial process for both the United Kingdom and the Union. Even more than 3 years after the formal implementation of Brexit now, a balance sheet is still complex. It is made more difficult by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, which has had at least a massive impact on the European order. Nevertheless, it can be said that while Brexit represented a severe loss for the EU, it changed Great Britain politically and economically, and that even more permanently. From a political perspective, Brexit marked a historic turning point for the EU. With the formal departure on January 31st in 2020, a member left the EU for the first time in history, and thus demonstrated that European integration is not a one-way street. Great Britain was already the EU member state with the most exemptions and internal opt-out clauses. However, the Union has now left its second largest member state in terms of both populations and economic power, which has caused it to shrink economically, politically, and culturally. The loss in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is particularly evident here. Because the United Kingdom, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council with its close ties to the USA and at least before the turn of the millennium, the largest defense budget of the European NATO states, remains an important player in Europe's security architecture. In 2022, London was one of Ukraine's strongest supporters and has established its own security partnerships with several Nordic and Central and Eastern European EU countries, and that's continuing. London has so far rejected structured cooperation with the EU, but has coordinated closely with the EU and the USA on sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine. On the other hand, the feared domino effect of exits from the EU has not materialized. Brexit has not been an issue in any other EU member state since the UK referendum in 2016. On the contrary, after the negative experiences of the British and the political chaos in London, leading EU opponents such as Marine Le Pen in France or Giorgia Meloni and Matteo Salvini in Italy have at least rhetorically distanced themselves from the goal of an EU exit or an exit from the euro. At the same time, approval for membership of the Union has increased across Europe. In no other issue in recent years has the EU appeared as united as in the Brexit negotiations. With the EU's 27 differences on other issues that remain huge, the EU was able to speak with one voice throughout the talks with London. All member states have supported the conduct of the negotiations by EU Brexit chief negotiator Michel Barnier at the time. They all shared an interest in protecting the EU internal market and the cohesion of the EU 27. Politically, Britain's exit has also paved the way for agreements that would otherwise have been blocked. This was particularly noticeable in security and defense policy, as well as in the Corona Recovery Fund. And that is different in Great Britain. Brexit has deeply divided the country and led to one of the most turbulent political periods in recent British history. With two snap elections at the time, 3 resignations of prime ministers with David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson. I skip Liz Truss a bit there. And numerous historic defeats for the government and parliament. The starting point for the political crisis in the United Kingdom was the close outcome of the referendum. Just a narrow majority of the Britons that went to vote on the day, with 52 to 48%, voted in favour of leaving the EU. Brexit had a majority in rural England and Wales in particular, while the population in Scotland, Northern Ireland and many English cities voted to remain. In addition, there was no clear idea of Brexit in the referendum. Until the end of 2019, there was a debate about how far the country should decouple itself from the EU, also from its internal market and the customs union, or even whether a second referendum should take place. In this process, those within the Conservative Party and in the early elections in December 2019, led by Boris Johnson, prevailed, and those who called for the clearest possible separation from the EU. Under the motto "Get Brexit Done" and promoted by the British electoral system, Johnson was able to achieve an absolute majority and pushed through the harder Brexit. It was not the hardest, but a harder one. And this triumph of the Brexiteers changed the Conservative Party and the political culture of Great Britain. Many moderate Conservatives who had advocated closer cooperation with the EU were pushed out of the parliamentary group or even the party. At the same time, the party also moved to the right on cultural issues. In the COVID pandemic. And with this strategy, the Conservative Party won many former Labour voters and tipped the balance between the Labour Party and the Conservatives in the country since the Conservatives won the elections in December 2019. None of the major parties is questioning the exit from the EU itself or publicly advocating a return to the EU. Labour also only criticizes the government for not implementing Brexit properly. The population does not rate Brexit as a success, though. A stable majority of more than 50% now consider Brexit to be a mistake, compared to almost 40% who still think it's the right thing to do. In the long term, Brexit endangers cohesion in the country. In 2016, 62% of the Scottish population voted to remain in the EU. And from the point of view of the governing Scottish National Party, the SNP, Scotland was torn out of the EU against its will and forced into a hard Brexit. The party is therefore calling for a new independence referendum once again, and I talked about this in another video a few days ago. Support for Scottish independence has increased in the wake of Brexit and has leveled off at 50-50. It is unclear whether and when a second independence referendum can take place, but the British government has so far rejected a new vote, citing the 2014 vote, and they have the Supreme Court decision. But Brexit was even more drastic for Northern Ireland, the majority of whose population also voted to remain in the EU. Dealing with Northern Ireland and how to keep the border with EU member Ireland open, which is Britain's only land border with the EU and is also closely linked to the Northern Ireland peace process, has become one of the most difficult aspects of the Brexit negotiation process. While Theresa May at the time wanted to accept a softer Brexit for the unity of the kingdom, Boris Johnson pushed through his hard Brexit with the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol. And accordingly, Northern Ireland received a special status in which many rules of the internal market continue to apply there, and customs checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain take place in the Irish Sea. This arrangement has enabled checks to be avoided at the border with Ireland and has given Northern Ireland greater economic growth than the rest of the UK except London. However, the economic integration of Northern Ireland is gradually shifting from Great Britain to Ireland and with that to the EU, so that the protocol was rejected by Northern Irish Unionists but also by Brexiteers. The British government was calling for a long time for the protocol to be renegotiated and even threatened in the summer of 22 to unilaterally break the protocol and thus also the EU exit agreement if necessary. Neither an agreement with the EU nor a return to a functioning government to Northern Ireland was in sight for some time. One of this is sorted now. But Brexit has had the greatest impact on the economic relationship between the EU and Great Britain. And at its core, the EU remains an economic community, and with Brexit, Great Britain also left the EU internal market and the customs union. Before the Brexit referendum, the Remain campaign tried to convince the British to remain in the EU, primarily with economic arguments and scenarios of major losses in prosperity. When assessing the economic consequences, it should first be emphasized that Boris Johnson's government opted for the clearest possible separation from the EU, the only one except the WTO. And in the spectrum of possible economic relations between the Union and third countries, the country has consequently become much more isolated than, for example, Norway, which has an almost complete participation in the internal market via the European Economic Area, or Switzerland, which has bilateral agreements, or Turkey, which is in a customs union, or even Ukraine. A no-deal Brexit, the exit without any regulations, was just prevented after tough negotiations, and instead Brussels and London concluded a trade and cooperation agreement in December 2020, which, alongside with the withdrawal agreement of January 2020, puts relations on a new footing. Economically, it replaces the earlier participation in the internal market and the customs union with a free trade agreement in which there are neither a lot of tariffs or quantity restrictions between the EU and Great Britain, but numerous regular non-tariff trade barriers and border checks that have to be reintroduced. About 40% of British exports went to the EU at the time, and nevertheless, trade with the most important trading partner by far has become considerably more difficult, and as have pan-European supply chains. Opportunities for EU Europeans to work in the UK and vice versa have also been significantly restricted. As the switch from the Brexit transition phase to the new trade agreement took place in January 2021, that means in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, there it was a bit more difficult to separate the exact economic consequences from the consequences of the pandemic and the lockdown measures. But the British think tank CER assumed at the time that the British economy was around 5% lower than what it would have been without Brexit. The exit is British productivity. However, this led to a slowdown in economic growth and a long-term decline in economic momentum. There was no massive one-off slump like the one triggered by the pandemic, but in the long term, the British Budgetary Authority assumes that the economic consequences of Brexit will be more serious than those of the pandemic. And a lot of this has to do with the preparations that were made during the transition period before the TCA came finally into force. So the agreement between the EU and the UK, they made just in time for the end of the transition period. And that is the reason why at the moment on other videos I'm talking a bit more about the preparations certain countries have done, EU member countries, but also the UK and the EU as a whole. And because those preparations had a big impact on what was happening afterwards as well. And that is not the most important announcement I wanted to make, because from this Sunday, there will be Outside Views live streams again. As I told you earlier, I was planning this for quite some time, but then the Russian hackers hit, and that shifted a lot of work here as well. But this Sunday at 6 p.m. CET, there will be an Outside Views live stream again, and that will be the case for the most Sundays that are coming up. And if you want to be more actively involved in this one, for the very first one, there is a post on my community post that where you can leave questions for Sunday. So in this one, you can actively take part by handing in questions as well. And there will be some questions from patrons and members as well. And those from the post, I will have a look there, what questions are there. And there will be different other topics, of course, surrounding Brexit, UK politics, etc. And so I hope to see you on Sunday as well. But if you want to see something else right now, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.